Welcome to the Environmental Due Diligence podcast by Lightbox, the podcast dedicated to environmental professionals. At Lightbox, we are at the forefront of delivering solutions for commercial real estate intelligence. Today, our host, Alan Agadoni, SVP Environmental Due Diligence Solutions at Lightbox, talks to Jim Bartlett, Senior Vice President at Bureau Veritas, who is also Chairman of ASTM Subcommittee E5002 and Secretary of E50 Committee, about many of the recent developments involving ASTM standards that impact best practices for commercial real estate due diligence.
I want to say welcome and thanks to people listening in. If you haven't listened to our first podcast yet, you can do so. We talk about PFAS and circular hazardous substances. Check that out on our website. Today, we have a treat for you because we're going to be talking with Jim Bartlett, whom I have been fortunate enough to know for many years. And we're going to talk about what's going on with ASTM, his role at ASTM, and some of the things that I think everybody should know about it because it's of its importance to the industry. So we're going to start there. Then we're going to talk about some of the recent changes to some key due diligence standards, especially the E2018 standard for property condition assessments, which Jim had a hand in and can tell us all about it. And finally, we're going to be talking a little bit about some of the new standards and perhaps back at some of the standards that passed over the last couple of years too, and give some updates on what we might be seeing this year and next coming from ASTM. So with that, Jim, welcome. Thank you again for joining us and sharing your knowledge and experience. At our Dallas PRISM event, you did a really good job. I think maybe for the first time, I completely understood all of the ASTM structure, committees and practices and procedures. Maybe you could help us out and briefly explain kind of the structure of the committees that serve as the basis for what we do every day here as environmental professionals and due diligence professionals.
Sure, Alan. And again, thanks for inviting me here. And we did have a blast down at the PRISM conference in Texas. And if anybody wants a copy of that presentation, I believe that they can pull that down from the Lightbox website. But just basically, the ASTM International has been around for 125 years, and they set standards for all kinds of products and services that, need to be performed in a consistent and repeatable way. If you go to the hardware store, start shopping around, you'll see bags of cement and PVC pipe and lumber. They all have ASTM standards stamped right on them. So there are, all kinds of standards. There are over 13,000 or nearly 13,000 standards managed by 147 different committees that fall into 80 different technical categories. And it's fascinating to go in and look at those and see the range of things that are standardized. And that's, there are over 30,000 members, and it is very international. There are members in 100 countries, and it's a good deal. If you're an environmental professional, if you're trying to actively participate in the industry, it's only $115 a year. The meetings, the conferences, they're all free. Our group meets twice a year in April and October, and all you have to do is get there and pay for your hotel room, and the actual event is no charge, and you can participate in the development of these standards. So within our group, most environmental professionals tend to gravitate towards E50. E50 is the main committee. It's on environmental assessment, risk management, and corrective action. It was formed in 1990. And then within that, there are 7 subcommittees. The one that is nearest and dearest to my heart is E5002, the group that I chair. That is the real estate assessment and management subcommittee. Within that group, we have 14 standards currently that we manage, and then there are 5 more that are currently in development. So we have about 450 members total, and I believe that the Phase 1 standard, I've heard, is the number 1 selling standard that ASTM publishes out of all those standards. So I think that has a lot to do with the fact that it's tied to circular liability and establishing all appropriate inquiries. It's cited in the regulations, so it's a really popular one.
And Jim, one of the things that you did a good job explaining at the event was the difference between a standard guide, a standard practice. For those who are not familiar, could you lay that out for us real quick?
Yeah, sure. There are various types of standards. There are test methods. There are laboratory things. Within our group, we tend to have 2 flavors. We have standard guides, and standard practices. So standard guide is like a toolbox. It's a set of guiding principles, like the PCA standard is a standard guide. So it's not prescriptive like the phase 1 standard is a standard practice. Yeah. Very prescriptive. Thou shalt, you must, you will. You're trying to meet a defensible legal position by completing the standard and complying with the standard. Whereas a guide is you're setting up standard terminology. You have basic framework for performing the service and lots of different options. So,
and on both of those, whether it's standard, practice, a guide, you can still call them standards, right? It's okay to use the word standards.
Yes, they're all standard.
Yes.
So you have standard guide and standard practice.
And they all have to be reviewed, supported, and reballoted potentially in a cycle, right? That's part of the deal.
So if you and your buddies get together and you decide that we really need a standard on something that we do as an industry, you have to decide first, is it going to be a standard guide or a standard practice? And then you're going to go through the development process. Usually you're trying to reflect what is being done in the market right now. So you're trying to reflect good and common practice. And that process can take a year, 2 years. A typical standard could be developed within a year or two. 2 years is typical. But once you get that passed, it requires a balanced vote. So users, producers, other interests, their attorneys, you have to have a balanced vote in order to pass a standard. And once a standard is published, it is released to the industry. We begin implementing it, putting it into practice. And after it has been published for 5 years, we have to decide, do we need to make any changes to this standard? Or is anybody using this standard? So you'll put out typically a procedural ballot to call for any changes to the standard or to publish it, republish it as is with no changes. And usually that will get some attention and that'll start the revision process. But basically the way it works is if you get to December 31st of the 8th year, a standard will automatically sunset. So It'll become an historical standard. It'll automatically be sunsetted and withdrawn if it's not supported by a new task group.
In short, basically, the key word I always think about when I think about ASTM is consensus. What these standards, guides, and practices are industry consensus about what should happen, how it should happen, why we do what we do, how we do what we do. But let's move on. Let's go to talk about some of the key standards that have changed recently. We've talked a lot about 1527, so we'll set that one aside for now. But let's talk a little bit about the PCA standard, because that was one that you were involved in.
Yeah, a task group was formed on this. We began working on updates to the standard about 3 years ago. We did a series of ballots, and the standard was published in January of this year, January 2024. And you had asked about grandfathering,
I know that the idea of grandfathering came from 1527, but is there anything like that in this standard?
Well, no, because it's a standard guide, there is no grandfathering. It's just the old one, which was E2018-15. It was published in 2015. It's now just an historical standard. Okay. And there really wouldn't be any reason to use the old one because the new one is better. It's vastly improved. There were over 140 changes made in 2018. A lot of them are improvements in the wording and the structure of the standard to make it clearer, to eliminate redundancy. We cleaned up a lot of the definitions and references. There's a whole new reference documents section. And it expands the usefulness of the standard beyond just the transactional baseline PCA. 2018 is being cited for all kinds of purposes, from acquisitions and, of course, underwriting, but also for facility management, asset management, managing portfolios, and so forth. So it really needed to be brought up to date, and the current version really does that.
Maybe there's people listening in who don't know what a property condition assessment even is. Why don't we tell them real quick what that's all about?
Well, sure. Property condition assessment at its heart is an inspection and assessment of all the major building components and systems with the goal of communicating deficiencies to a user. Yeah. And the purpose of the PCA guide has been changed. So from 2015 to 2024, section 1.1, which is purpose, the previous purpose was to define good commercial practice for conducting a baseline PCA. So that sounds like, oh, baseline PCA. It's kind of a, hey, one size fits all. Well, that's really not what the intent is. The purpose now, as it's written, is to define a framework for conducting a PCA. So it's a baseline process, not a baseline report. So essentially, when you have a baseline process, it's going to require you to understand the user's purpose and objectives, because there's so many myriad, purposes for a PCA, different objectives that users have, whether you're a lender or a purchaser or an existing owner. You're ordering a PCA for a specific reason, and that reason is going to dictate, what should be in that PCA, and how hard do you look at things, and what are your goals and objectives?
What are some of the things that you think are super important they should know about?
Well, I think that, again, the user responsibility section has been updated to add that the user should be conveying what the purpose of the PCA is and work with the consultant to modify the scope of the assessment to satisfy those objectives. So if there is no specific objective provided, then you can assume that the reason you're doing a PCA is to support the continued current use of the property. So it's just going to steady as she goes, no major rehabilitation, change of use, modification. Those are all things that the consultant would need to know in order to provide a more tailored type of report. And so there's this whole idea of modifications to that baseline process. There's a whole new appendix that goes into really great detail about that. And that's something that's long overdue. It always goes back to, how is the standard really used and implemented in the industry? As an example, I'd say one of the second major changes that was made is a discussion of long-term costs. You go back and you look at the various iterations of the PCA standard, which has been around for a while, and it only talks about immediate and short-term costs. So basically 1 to 2 years, without any mention of long-term costing. Everybody knows, if you're underwriting a loan, you want to see a reserve term, that's the term of the loan plus 2 years. And when I'm talking about a reserve term, we're talking about capital expenditures that are expected. So immediate repairs, those would be things like deferred maintenance. You've got holes in the parking lot, there's a roof leak, those are things that need to be fixed right away. But then you can anticipate, based on the effective age and the remaining useful life of various components, how long they're going to last. If a roof would normally last 20 years and it's 15 years old, you want to see a cost out in year 5 to replace it. This new version really goes into a lot of detail on cost tables, long-term costs. So there is both a new definition for long-term costs, and there is a lengthy new guidance section in the appendix. It's Appendix X1 that has 6 subsections that talks about all the things, the considerations that go into establishing long-term costs.
And that's clearly a collaborative effort, isn't it? I mean, in terms of establishing how long-term you go.
Absolutely. Yes. The typical, if you're an owner of a property, if you're acquiring a property, we normally see 10 years. For financial, it tends to be, 12 years is kind of universal. But if you remember back in the old days, a permanent loan, quote unquote, was 10 years, pretty much across the board. So people wanted to see a 10 plus 2, so 12-year reserve term. That's still the most kind of portable and transferable PCA result. If you're not sure where in the capital stack it's going to end up, 12 years is pretty safe. But a lot of people want to see the term of the loan plus 2. So if it's a 5-year loan, you might get a 7-year, but people tend to default to 10 years for what we call equity and 12 years for debt.
It's one of those things kind of like E1527 where people have been doing this, but we needed to get it into writing, right? And alert people, especially people coming up into the industry, young people, about what the expectations are and some of the things they can do to avoid problems.
I would echo that. I mean, part of that 8-year cycle is forcing the wisdom of the industry in terms of implementing this. There are regulatory changes, there are changes in technology, there are a lot of things that affect the way we do things today. And so by requiring the standard to be updated at least once every 8 years, and you don't have to wait 8 years. If there's some big breaking news in the industry that really changes the game, the standard can be modified at any time. A new work item can be opened. And if we really miss something or we really need to add something, then the task group will reform and review, and they can even ballot just a piece of a standard. So that's always out there. The third major modification, this one's near and dear to my heart because I led the focus group on it, were the revisions to the ADA Accessibility and Fair Housing Act accessibility screening, which is optional. When you do a PCA, you don't have to look at ADA stuff, but it's very typical, again, very common that it is added. And that's in Appendix X2 and X3. It really needed to be updated because it only dealt with the federal standard, and it could have been interpreted as, if you fill out the simple checklist, that constitutes completing an ADA survey, when it really doesn't. It's just a very bare bones, a minimal screening for obvious visually observable defects, no measurements, and also the previous version did not take into account or provide guidance that state and local requirements, accessibility codes, regulations, et cetera, where they're more stringent than the federal requirements, take precedence. So state and local will trump federal, and that wasn't in there, and it is in there now. So I think that was a good cleanup. But again, it's not an ADA survey. So if people need an ADA survey, a lot of times the PCA will be used to say, it looks like you have a lot of issues. You should go do a full measured survey. And so I think that's a big improvement.
That's a big plus. So just to wrap the PCAs up, what do you suggest if you're a PCA practitioner or someone who reads a lot of these things, what do you suggest people do?
Well, I'll do a shameless plug. I did do a change summary. It's a comparative change summary between the 2015 standard and the 2024. So if you're really trying to get into 2018 and you want to be super nerdy about it, you can hit me up on LinkedIn, and I believe I'll post a link there. I actually have 3 versions of the summary because there's so many changes. And, it's worth a read. I have kind of a small, medium, and large version of it. But if you want kind of a line-by-line comparison of all of the changes, you can get the big one. It's about 24 pages.
And I highly recommend that you do that. Because sitting down and just studying a revised standard and trying to compare it back to the old one, it's very difficult to do without that. Thank you for doing that. And thanks to the committee and everybody for all the work there. It looks really good. And kudos to you for that. So thank you. Let's finish up with talk about some of the things that are coming down the pipeline. Everybody wants to know what's new or what's changing.
Sure. Let's go back to 1527. I know we have a lot of environmental professionals on the line, and everybody watches 1527, the phase 1 standard. It was republished. It was 2.5 years ago now. It's been amazing. That also was about a 3-year grueling process of updates. There are a couple of things that happened this year in February, 2024. The EPA derecognized 1527.13. If anybody is still using that standard, or if anybody is asking for that version of the standard, I'd love to hear your rationale for doing that, because it's no longer valid for establishing a defense against circular liability, or establishing one of the landowner liability protections. The second big breaking news is that a lot of you have heard there is a certified environmental professional designation that will soon be offered by ASTM. A few years ago, ASTM became a certifying body so that they can actually do professional certifications. And because 1527 is one of the most popular standards, it made sense to put that training in place. So what that'll consist of, entirely voluntary. If you want to become an ASTM certified environmental professional, you'll be able to do that by taking a couple of day training offered by ASTM, and then taking what I hear is a very hard test. If you pass that test, you will get the designation. So they've been working on that. There's a group, a training committee within E5002, led by Tim Haley, who have been working very diligently on this for quite a while. And I have heard that it's coming down the home stretch and will be out later this year. We have standards in development too. I mentioned that we have 5 different standards currently in development, and that's a lot. There's a lot going on. We've had people who are very interested in the evolution of the practice, the things that we do. The first one is drone assessments. So for a few years, people have been saying, hey, we've started using drones more often, like couldn't get access to the roof. So we sent a drone out and got some drone imagery. Or if you're looking at parking lots, being able to have high resolution imagery is better than going out and taking 100 pictures at various angles. So because it has become very commonplace to use drones, we received a lot of input that E5002 should add a drone assessment standard. There is a whole committee on drones. F38 is the committee on drones. We kept saying, go talk to them, because there's a whole committee. But the F-38, as it turns out, they're more into standards related to airworthiness and drone specification, pilot training, regulatory considerations. So it actually works well where we're talking about having a kind of a common denominator standard for the use of drones and how you would apply drones to the due diligence or the site assessment. Right now it's a Wild West. If you say, hey, I want to get drone imagery of a site, you call 3 different drone companies, you're going to get 3 very different scopes of work. There isn't a standard out there, all kinds of different terminology. So I think that by having a standard guide, users will have a published framework, common terminology, common denominators, maybe like a scope of work checklist. We're going to have a legal appendix. What are some of the, people are afraid of the liability, drones falling out of the sky and access issues and so forth. So it'll provide a good guidance, a compendium for real estate professionals who are using drones to have apples to apples, comparison.
If you're going to go into scoping it all as far as when drone use might be appropriate versus when it might not be?
Yes. So actually, we just talked about this. There is a monthly conference call. Anybody wants to get involved in the discussion. We've been meeting for about a year, and we now have a straw man draft of the thing, which we'll be discussing this month at our next meeting. Usually our meetings are around the 3rd week of every month, and we go for about an hour. We also have a collaboration area, so you can look at all of the past materials. We went out, we did an industry survey, did an outline. So you can look at all of that and see who's participating. We're getting a lot of participation from EO 625. That's the whole buildings group. We have people from F-38, the drone committee. So there's a lot of cross-pollination. But you'll see things like specialty areas for large parcels or inaccessible or dangerous areas, roofs, parking lots, facades, site monitoring. If you want to do monitoring of environmental conditions or construction, it can be very useful for that. So I think it'll be a very useful toolkit and the first of its kind that we're aware of.
I think it'll cover environmental and the physical condition side too. So that's really interesting. What else you got? What else is coming down the pipeline?
Okay. So, well, also in the transactional world, there is construction loan monitoring. So a lot of folks who are listening today might have a group that goes out for lenders, people who are doing construction financing. They need a review of the documents and budgets, the construction package. So there is going to be a standard. Now, there are actually 2 standards. One is for the plan and cost, document and budget review, and then a separate guide for doing the construction monitoring. So there's a monthly draw request, and there is monitoring and reporting that is done to discuss the progress of the project and to make a recommendation to fund that particular draw. So that one is in progress, very active, and they're also meeting once a month. They have a collaboration area. That one is one of our newest ones. The very newest one is the zoning reports. So a lot of people, when they are doing an acquisition or financing, they'll require a zoning report. Some people will call them the PZR.
Zoning is like many of the other components of a phase 1 or some of the other things that are going on in due diligence. Zoning is an integral part of that. Is this the first time we've had a zoning standard, or is this a development of a previous one?
Yeah, so we polled the industry, and I believe this will be the first. So it's kind of one of those head scratchers where you say, why don't we have a standard for that? It's always better to have a published standard to reference. If you're going to go out and write your own scope of work, you're creating your own standard of care, and you should be prepared to defend that. Why did you decide to do that? Think of it as an exhibit A in a trial. Here's what you came up with, and here's what the industry is doing. So it's always better to have that published standard of care and, to come up with those common denominators. In this case, you've got common research elements for zoning to determine conforming uses and so forth. So I think that that'll be a good one. There's another one that is important that will be coming out very much in the earliest development stages, which is a facility condition assessment standard. And you're asking yourself, what's the difference between a facility condition assessment and a property condition assessment? Right now, facility condition assessments, they cite the 2018 standard, the PCA standard, but it's really not the best fit. What I mean by that is a facility condition assessment is often not associated with a transaction. So they're not looking for a PCR, a property condition report that is generated from a property condition assessment. They want the data. They want to understand the condition of the facility and certain components, which they decide, what do you want in your FCA? Is it all your mechanical systems? Is it your roofs? Is it your parking lots? But you want to understand for facility planning purposes what the condition of all that is. And you want the data. You want to be able to modify it over time. You want to be able to put things in. You might want to do inventory and barcoding and connect it with your maintenance management system. So one of the things we've seen in the industry is that there's been a huge proliferation of maintenance management systems, MMS or CMMS, computerized maintenance management systems. And those are very powerful tools for giving you a lot of information about your facility and managing the maintenance proactively, but they don't populate themselves. You have to get somebody who knows what they're looking at to go out and inventory those systems and give you an idea of their current condition and how much longer they're going to last, and what maintenance procedures should be done on those systems. And then all of that will go into a database. So there needs to be a standard for FCAs. We've had some folks come forward and express an interest in participating in developing an FCA standard. There are a few others that are out there. There's the UK, there's the Royal Institution of Chartered Surveyors. NASA has a good one, FCAs that are public agencies. But I think that the PCA standard is a great place to start, but we're going to modify the PCA standard to reflect what's important to people who need FCAs. And so that discussion is just beginning. If you're interested in participating in that, or if there's somebody in your organization who does FCAs, like to be part of that discussion. For Bureau Veritas, this is a very important field. We do a lot of FCAs, both for government and institutional folks and people with large portfolios. And so we see this as a very rapidly growing area. And if you'd like to be part of that discussion, you can join us there.
So we've been through a number of these generations of revisions related to both E1527 and E2018, so ESAs and PCAs. And given what you told us earlier about having to think about them every 5 to 8 years and update them, it seems to me, and maybe it seems to you as well, that that's going to be very interesting to think about what these standards are going to be like in 5 to 8 years. Have you thought about kind of with AI and with drones and robots and who knows what else we're going to be dealing with in 8 years? But how do you think that plays out with some of these ASTM standards? Is it just going to be, we're going to keep doing what we're doing?
I mean, the one thing that's constant is change, right? And we think about this all the time. If you break it down, the PCA stuff is very exciting. But let's look at environmental first. As you mentioned in the last podcast, you're talking about PFAS. We're already getting a lot of questions about how are these emerging contaminants going to affect the need to change the standard for 1527. We actually anticipated that in the 21 update. If you look in the appendix, there's a discussion about emerging contaminants, the PFAS, and here, for people who aren't aware, the PFOS, PFOS and PFOA, which are a couple of the PFAS chemicals, were recently added to the EPA's list of hazardous materials that are regulated under CERCLA. But we put in the standard the last time that unregulated emerging contaminants should be treated as BERs, or business environmental risks. But that if they are regulated, then the practice automatically applies because the practice is set up to identify recognized environmental condition, which covers the CERCLA, hazardous materials, and petroleum products. So it's already in there. We don't need to change anything because the EPA has added some chemicals. And there are, I think, like 1,000 different PFAS compounds. Right? Yeah, and more will come. But, the 1527 is very tied to regulatory changes. So if there are other regulatory changes that affect the environmental practice, that could necessitate changes to the standard. So who knows? There could be something about climate impacts on RECs and BERs, something that comes to the fore. But you can't get too crazy with 1527 because it's cited in the EPA's regulations. They have to approve any changes. So we can't get wild and crazy with a bunch of changes. They are always part of the discussion and a very active participant.
Thanks for putting that into context too, because I believe we are in a different world with E1527 versus some of the other standards that aren't codified in law. I know there are others that are, but I think in our world, the due diligence, commercial real estate world, we are looking at that standard is maybe one of the slowest to change going forward, but we have now these other exciting ones like drones and cloning, where we can figure out some new and interesting things to use our technology and our means and methods to get things done. So it's going to be a lot of fun.
On the PCA side, I mean, PCAs, FCAs, anything where you're trying to look at something and determine if it has a deficiency, AI and machine learning, thermal and hyperspectral imaging. I mean, there are all kinds of things that are coming out. They're being used right now where I could basically scan a system or a piece of equipment and get information about it. Once you get these machine learning algorithms where you can process prior reports, maintenance records, and you can ingest all of that and then use that combined with the observation of that item, it's a complete game changer. There's all kinds of things that are happening with augmented reality and virtual reality, 3D VR, that are becoming very common. We're using them right now. So to forecast what it'll look like 5-10 years from now, very exciting discussion.
And so if anybody wants to get involved in that, I know you've talked a little bit about people getting involved in ASTM.
Sure. I go to ASTM.org and take a look. There are a lot of groups that you might want to be involved in. I like E5002, obviously, but I'm a member of a couple of other committees. D22 is the indoor air quality group. So if you're a CIH, you want to hang out with other microbial nerds, you can look at D22. EO6 25 is the whole buildings standard, and they're rolling out the PRA, the property resilience assessment. They maintain the seismic standards. You can join as many as you want. It's one price. It's an unlimited all-you-can-eat buffet of knowledge and collaboration with your industry peers.
Sounds great. Hey, so Jim, until we talk again, which I hope we do soon, thanks a lot. Appreciate your time, not only for this podcast, but for everything you've been doing. So much appreciated. And I want to thank our listeners who've already started giving us feedback. So thank you for giving us feedback and questions or suggestions for future topics. Contact me or your EDR Lightbox representative. Cheers, everybody. We'll see you next time.
Thanks, Alan.
Thanks, Jim.
Thank you for listening to the Environmental Due Diligence podcast by Lightbox. Tune in next month for timely coverage of news and issues impacting commercial property due diligence. This podcast was produced by the team at Lightbox, your trusted source for commercial real estate intelligence. Access this episode and all future episodes at lightboxre.com/podcast or your favorite podcast streaming platform. Until next time, thanks for listening.